Episode 13, Panhellenion. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. Last time, we followed Hadrian on his travels around the Roman Empire. Unlike any emperor before him, he was constantly on the move. The empire's administration ran from wherever Hadrian happened to be that month. His travels had several purposes: inspecting the defenses, ensuring discipline of the legions, ordering new improvements, founding colonies, granting citizenship, and generally blessing the provinces, directly, in person, in a way no emperor had done since Augustus. Notable among his actions last decade were the construction of a wall from sea to sea in Britannia, the beautification of Athens, and the beginning of his relationship with Antinous. The guiding principle behind Hadrian's actions was creating a peaceful and prosperous commonwealth across his empire, where the provinces were treated not as conquered subjects, but as integral to the whole as Rome or Italy. Unifying this commonwealth of peoples would be Greek culture and Roman law and order, maintained by the legions. Peace held for the past 10 years, but this decade, we will see Hadrian experience personal loss and public rebellion. Hadrian's Hellenism was not embraced by everyone. When he pushed an already frustrated people too far, they violently rose up. Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1, A Death on the Nile. Part 2, Panhellenion. Part 3, The Last Jewish War. Part 4, Machinations of Succession. Part 5, Dutiful. Part 1, A Death on the Nile. We last left Hadrian and Antinous with the imperial entourage in Antioch. If you missed last decade, Antinous was a teenage boy that Hadrian had first met in 123. By 125, Hadrian had become infatuated with the boy, becoming an Erastes, a lover of his Eromenos, his beloved. As Hadrian traveled from province to province, Antinous was with him. Leaving Antioch, Egypt was their destination. Before crossing out of Syria, Hadrian is said to have climbed to the top of a mountain where he and Trajan had once come years earlier to worship at a Beetle, a sacred stone inhabited by a god. Back, this time without his great-uncle, he again offered a sacrifice to the gods as the sun rose. A storm began to whip up. As he watched, his sacrifice and the attendant were struck by lightning. The emperor took this as a sign that Zeus approved of his program. As the party passed into Judea, they found it still recovering from the war of 66 to 70 and the revolts of 115 to 117. Just like everywhere else, Hadrian planned for restoring Judea and Jerusalem, which still lay in ruins after its sacking by Titus in 70. The Jews looked to Hadrian's visit with hope. They saw him as a protector, maybe even someone who would allow them to rebuild their lost temple. Why this positive view? First, Hadrian had removed and killed Lucius Quietus, Trajan's general who had terrorized the Jews of Judea and Mesopotamia. Second, he relinquished Mesopotamia, freeing the Jews living there from Roman domination. And third, Hadrian for the last decade had been busy restoring destroyed cities and building temples. He had restored the fortunes of other peoples, why not the Jews too? But if the Judeans thought they'd receive the same treatment as their polytheistic neighbors, they were to be disappointed. Hadrian committed to building a new temple to Jupiter Zeus on the very site of the old Jewish temple. With his goal of Hellenistic unity and Jerusalem in ruins, why not rebuild the city and start fresh? A new temple for a new city. Jerusalem was no more. It was now named Aelia Capitolina and given the status of a Roman colony. Hadrian's stop in Judea was brief. He and his entourage left while his plans were still in the works. The locals weren't yet aware of his intentions for their city. The imperial entourage skirted the Sinai and came to Pelusium, the easternmost city of the Nile Delta in Egypt. Only 3 emperors had visited Egypt before, and Hadrian had much work to do here after the devastating revolts of the prior decade. In Pelusium, they came to the tomb of Pompey, which had been destroyed. Hadrian honored Pompey, the conqueror of Syria and Judea, and provided funds for the monument to be rebuilt on a grander scale. The imperial party came to Alexandria for a time. Hadrian restored the temple of Serapis, a syncretistic deity which united aspects of the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis with Zeus. A shrine to the Muses was also refurbished. As summer drew to a close, the entourage gathered at Heliopolis and began a cruise down the Nile. As they left the Nile Delta, the flotilla passed the Great Pyramids of Egypt on their right, buildings beyond ancient, even for the Romans. They went upstream to Hermopolis and visited the temple of Thoth and prepared for the festival of Osiris, celebrating the death and rebirth of this god. When the day came, the Roman flotilla partied the night away on the river, probably celebrating and imbibing late into the night. When the bright morning came, the entourage were slow to rise. But with the coming of the light, a body was found floating in the river. It was a young man, no older than 18, well-proportioned and strong, with wavy hair and a beautiful face. Antinous. He was dead, drowned in the river. Ever since the discovery of Antinous's body, the cause of death has been questioned. The simplest explanation is that it was an accident. Sometime during the night, Antinous had slipped into the river and drowned. Maybe he slipped and hit his head. Maybe he drank too much. But for this to happen to the second most watched member of the entourage seems unlikely. Writing several decades after Hadrian's death, Cassius Dio proposed a second version of events. Antinous's death had been a sacrifice. In Alexandria, Hadrian had visited a magician named Pancrates, who prophesied that a life should be surrendered freely for the accomplishment of the ends Hadrian had in view. For Hadrian to accomplish all that he planned, or perhaps to save his life, a life would need to be surrendered. 2 possibilities branched from this interpretation. Antinous, aware of the oracle, had voluntarily killed himself to ensure Hadrian's health and success. The alternative and more sinister explanation is that Hadrian sacrificed the person most dear to him in order that his programs succeed. A third explanation is that Antinous committed suicide, either because, as he reached puberty, he saw himself losing the charms which drew Hadrian to him, or perhaps the relationship was already strained, and Hadrian had violently lashed out, something he did tend to do to those who were close to him. Regardless of the cause of Antinous's death, Hadrian was deeply shaken by grief at the loss of his beloved. The Historia Augusta says, "For this youth he wept like a woman." The death of Antinous shook Hadrian, and he turned to brooding in silence. The flotilla paused with this death, but even the loss of Hadrian's beloved did not qualify for a cancellation of the voyage. The boats continued upstream, deep into the ancient Nile. One evening, not long after the death, Hadrian noticed a bright star in the sky. He conferred with his astrologers, and they confirmed his hopes. The new star was Antinous, ascended to the heavens. The party came to Thebes in Upper Egypt, a city fallen low since its height during the New Kingdom period. The main attraction was not the town or the temples though, but the statue of Memnon, which sometimes sang. The story goes that, most commonly at first light, but other times too, from the partially ruined statue would emanate the sound of a single plucked lyre string. The imperial entourage took turns visiting the stone. Hadrian at first visit heard nothing. His wife Sabina heard the god sing several times. Finally, on November 21st, Hadrian heard the sound. Perhaps he had not been wholly abandoned by the gods. We know of this visit thanks to a poem carved, or we could say graffitied, into the statue of Memnon's leg. 4 engravings were left by Julia Balbilla, a poet and handmaiden to Sabina, who was traveling with the entourage. I personally find it astounding that something as old and ephemeral as Hadrian's voyage down the Nile is attested by physical evidence. From here, the flotilla headed back downstream, back north toward Alexandria. When they came back to the site of Antinous' death, Hadrian ordered the construction of a city at the site, Antinoopolis. The city was not dedicated to just a dead young man. The new star in the sky assured Hadrian of that. The city was dedicated to a new god. Antinous, like Osiris, had drowned and risen to the heavens. With the Egyptian priests nodding along, Hadrian declared the deification of Antinous. The deification of humans in itself wasn't unusual in the classical world. In this series, we've seen Julius Caesar and Augustus become gods, along with most of the following emperors and many in their families. But what Hadrian did with the deification of Antinous broke all precedents. Antinous wasn't an emperor, nor was he from an imperial family, nor was he even Roman. The Senate had not granted its approval, nor had it even been consulted. It was all highly irregular and frowned upon by the senatorial class. None of that stopped Hadrian from promoting the cult of Antinous or the cult from spreading. The cult became particularly popular in the east of the empire, precisely because of its innovativeness and its un-Romanness, its accessibility to provincials. Antinous became popular as a god of healing, beauty, youth, and conquest of death. Sometimes considered a god, other times merely a hero, statues and temples of Antinous were built all over the empire. His face is among the most common statues that have been found from ancient Rome. The spread of this cult, and when I use the word cult, don't imagine something like a modern Heaven's Gate or Branch Davidian cult. Instead, I mean dedication to a particular god. Anyway, the spread of this cult was facilitated by Hadrian's encouragement as a Hellenistic rallying point, which Egyptians, Syrians, Greeks, and Romans could all worship. It didn't hurt that building a temple to Antinous was a great way to earn the emperor's favor. Even after Hadrian's death, though, the cult of Antinous persisted for centuries. Part 2. Panhellenion. Still grief-stricken, Hadrian stayed in Alexandria for a time. Maybe he was waiting for the lengthy process of the mummification of Antinous to finish. But in the spring of 131, Hadrian sailed north up the coast of the sea, past Judea, where work was about to begin on his plans in what was once called Jerusalem. He went past Syria, past Cyprus, into the Aegean, and into the old, familiar port of Athens. Still numbed by grief, Hadrian might have preferred to return to his villa outside of Rome, but the plans, made far ahead of time, could not easily be deserted. Cities had competed for years to earn a visit from the emperor, and it would be an insult to leave them hanging. Despite his emotional state, Hadrian honored his word. This visit to Athens was supposed to be a stop to celebrate all Hadrian had accomplished. So, Hadrian put on the best face he could muster and celebrated with the Athenians. The temple of Olympian Zeus had been completed, and Hadrian's visit signaled its inauguration. The Greek travel writer Pausanias, visiting a decade or two later, describes the statues housed inside. Hadrian, the Roman emperor, dedicated the temple and the statue, one worth seeing, which in size exceeds all other statues save the colossi at Rhodes and Rome, and is made of ivory and gold, with an artistic skill which is remarkable when the size is taken into account. Before the entrance, I say, stand 4 statues of Hadrian. Hadrian had done what neither the tyrants, nor Pericles, nor the heirs to Alexander had been able to do. he had finished the temple to Olympian Zeus. What would the Athenians of Pericles' day have thought if they learned that this temple had finally been completed by a ruler of the backward Italian city of Rome? To honor the emperor, who had done so much to improve and beautify Athens, the people of the city had funded an arch, Hadrian's Arch, standing between the Acropolis and the temple of Olympian Zeus. Looking through the arch toward the Acropolis is an inscription saying, "This is Athens, the city of Theseus." And on the reverse side, looking toward the new parts of the city, it said, "This is the city of Hadrian and not of Theseus." The buildings that Hadrian had added to Athens were nice, but more important to him was the inauguration of a new league of Greek cities, the Panhellenion. As you know by now, Hadrian was a huge fan and student of classical Greece, idolizing the politicians, rhetoricians, generals, historians, philosophers, playwrights, and poets of the golden age of Greece. In his study, he saw that the Greeks were most successful when they were united, as they had been to some degree against the Persian invasions, or under the leadership of Philip and Alexander of Macedon. But before and between and after those high points of unity, the history of the Greeks was one of constant squabbling and competition. Hadrian had seen it firsthand in his travels through the Greek East. Their competition had led to much of their greatness, but it also put a ceiling on it. Hadrian, by creating the Panhellenion, a new league of Greek cities, sought to end the squabbles and set them on a path of unity in arts and culture. Of course, this league was never intended to have military power, but its exact political purpose is controversial. We do know that it was primarily concerned with ceremonies, religious practices, and athletic and cultural events. It was to be a common body allowing dialogue and coordination. Each member city would send delegates to meet together in Athens. The question of who belonged in the league was one Hadrian had been pondering since at least his last visit to Athens in 128. Obviously, Athens and Sparta would have to be members, but what other cities should be included? There were many hundreds of Greek cities across Greece, Italy, North Africa, and Asia Minor, but not all of them could be included. Hadrian's criteria seems to have been cities that were unquestionably Greek, descending from Dorians, Ionians, or Aeolians, friendship with Rome since the Republic, and personal favor with Hadrian. It included famous cities: Athens, Sparta, Argos, Corinth, Thessalonica, and Rhodes. Some less famous ones: Samos, Megara, Chalcis, Cyrene, Perinthus, Miletus, Sardis, Apamea, and Apollonia. And some that only the biggest Greek heads have heard of: Demetrius, Amphiclya, Narica, Thyatira, Eumenia, Magnesia on the Meander, Ptolemais Barca Cabeira, Gortine, and Tralles, among others. Most of these I've never heard of. If you're able to point out all of these places on a map, please message me to explain how you attained such impressive levels of Hellenism. Notably absent from this list were large and wealthy cities of the Ionian coast of Asia Minor: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and Halicarnassus. The reason for their omission isn't clear to me. Not all of the cities I just listed were a part of the League immediately. An inscription has been found dating from 138 or 139 regarding the new admission of Magnesia on the Meander's entry into the League, so it was an evolving body while it lasted. The Panhellenion was an ideal of Hadrian's empire in miniature. Cities across 3 continents sharing a Greek culture united under the benevolent watch of Rome. Once Hadrian was gone, though, this league didn't last long, dissolving at some point during the long reign of his successor. The Greeks were always a fractious bunch, and without the strong and active hand of the emperor encouraging their cooperation, they fell back into their petty competitions. Part 3. Hellenistic Hubris. 2 decades earlier, before the 130s. If you remember back to Trajan's Parthian campaign, it was just at the high water mark of his conquests, as he was celebrating by visiting the room in Babylon, where Alexander the Great had died, that Trajan received news of rebellion. In a grim mirror of that episode, Hadrian was also at the peak of his own project, integration compared to Trajan's conquering, as he inaugurated the Panhellenion, that he received news of a rebellion breaking out in Judea. Yes, Judea again. In the spring of 132, a massive and well-planned rebellion began, called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, or the Third Jewish War. There would be no Fourth Jewish War. Unlike the First Jewish Revolt, which was covered by Josephus in depth, our sources for this war are pretty bare. So, based on what we know, let's answer a few questions to frame this conflict. Why did the rebellion break out? If you've listened to much of this series, especially the episodes on the 20s, the 30s, the 60s, the 70s, or the 110s, you will have heard some of the sometimes burning, always simmering conflict between the Judeans and the Romans. In short, from the beginning, the Jews resented being ruled by the Romans, and the Romans viewed the Judeans as odd and stubborn, the only people in their empire not willing to worship their gods. The Great Jewish Revolt of 66 to 70 and the Kitos War from 115-ish to 118-ish had led to long-lasting resentments between the two sides. But the more proximate causes of the war were the real sparks. As we covered earlier, Hadrian had big plans for the old center of Judaism. And the Judeans, seeing the beneficence of Hadrian had bestowed on other downtrodden people, thought he might do the same for them, that he might lift their crumbled city and renew it to its old glory. They were half right, but completely disappointed. He planned to convert the ruins of Jerusalem from a Jewish city to a polytheistic one. The Historia Augusta blames the revolt on Hadrian's banning of circumcisions, a critical religious practice for the Jews. It's unclear if this reference is historical, though. The final insult came in 131. The new governor of the province of Judea, Quintus Tineius Rufus, oversaw the foundation ceremonies for the creation of a new city on the old site of Jerusalem. The establishment of Aelia Capitolina as a Roman colony served a dual purpose: pushing Hadrian's Hellenization into a new province and punishing the Jews for the revolts of 115 to 118. The new colony, founded on the site of their old temple, ensured it would never be rebuilt. 60 years had passed since the old city's destruction, during which the Jews had begun to hope for restoration. But the intentions of the emperor were now in the open, clear to the Jews. Hadrian's Hellenism had bumped up against a people unwilling to conform to his plans. They would not stand for this oppression, so they took up arms. How was the rebellion organized? At the center of this rebellion was a man named in our sources as Simon Bar Kokhba. We don't know anything of his background. He springs into the history fully formed and leading the Jewish uprising. Our sources for him and the war in general are Cassius Dio, which, as I've mentioned before, is preserved only in summary here, to later Christian historians, Eusebius and Jerome, and the Jewish Talmud, where he is called Simon Bar Kokhba. This Simon was identified as the long-awaited Messiah by a leading rabbi of the time, Rabbi Akiva. This Messiah, according to Jewish tradition, would lead the people to victory over their enemy and establish a new kingdom where God could be worshipped rightly. In fact, the name Bar Kokhba means son of the star, as he was said to be the fulfillment of the star prophecy from the biblical book of Numbers, which says, "A star shall rise from Jacob." Jacob being the forefather of the Jews. Many were convinced that Simon was the fulfillment of this prophecy. For himself, Simon took the title Nasi Yisrael, the Prince of Israel. Simon and his allies drew wide support in Judea, but they did not strike against the Romans erratically. They planned every move, drawing lessons from the two previous unsuccessful revolts. We are told that they were well armed. As the revolt was being planned, Jewish arms makers working for the Romans had intentionally made weapons with defects. When these were inspected, they were found to be deficient and thrown out. The insurgents then collected these weapons, repaired them, and thus were well armed. Aside from proper equipment, their keys to victory were a distributed rebellion. They wouldn't be easily trapped in a single city like the rebels had been at the end of the first Jewish revolt, nor would they suffer from the divisions which impaired the first Jewish revolt. A distributed resistance was enabled by the construction of hundreds of tunnels and underground hideaways, which would allow them to escape from danger or make the superior numbers of the Romans useless. As far as unity went, although Simon had a large natural following, not everyone, even among the rebels, supported him. But Simon and his followers punished any Jew who refused to join him, a course that, along with his ultimate failure, has led to his condemnation in the Talmud, and his name there, Ben Koziba, translates to son of disappointment. What was the course of events? Unfortunately, describing a chronology of the war is difficult. We can't say what exactly the rebels did when they took action. What we can say is that from Modi'in they spread out, seizing towns, killing Romans, stopping taxes to the Romans, and, in short order, they had established a significant region of rebel control. Their coordination paid off, and they were able to sweep Roman resistance aside. They quickly established an independent state of their central region of Judea, which they called Israel, a name the Romans had never used for them. It appears that they were never able to seize Jerusalem, though, as this was the home of a legionary base, nor were the rebels able to expand to the degree the rebels of the first revolt had. The regions north and south of central Judea, Galilee, and Idumea remained outside their control. Despite their compact territory, they were united and well-governed, issuing coins and meting out justice. Their armies seem to have successfully bested the 2 legions already stationed in Judea. They may have also ambushed a legion sent from Arabia Petraea and annihilated it. That brings us to the Roman response. It quickly became clear that the 2 legions in the province were insufficient. The governors of Syria and Arabia Petraea brought the legions under their command to help quash the revolt. The fighting was intense. The Jewish rebels made effective use of the underground hideouts they had built, making the Romans' job of securing the country exponentially harder. In 132, Hadrian arrived in Judea and personally directed the operations. Hadrian preferred peace, but he was still an experienced military man. Precisely because he valued peace so highly, he was willing to expend massive resources to restore peace and order. And because the empire had been at peace, it could handle the sending of a huge force. There were already 6 legions in the country when Hadrian arrived, but due to the seriousness of the revolt, Hadrian called for even more backup. He tapped his most skilled general, the governor of Britannia, Sextus Julius Severus, who arrived by 133 and brought with him up to 6 more legions and auxiliaries. These 12 legions were now a far larger force than had taken part in the first Jewish revolt. The Romans employed a scorched earth campaign, destroying crops and wells, starving out towns, and engaging in warfare cruel enough that even with their hundreds of hideouts, the rebels faced a slow but steady defeat. Their loss was probably just as much due to sword as famine. Still, the Jewish rebels held out for over 3 years and continued to rule their new but ever-shrinking independent country. Facing an army this large, and an emperor now more determined than ever to stamp them out, they had little hope. By 136, or the end of 135, the Romans had successfully retaken town after town and reduced the rebels to a single stronghold called Batar. Following a siege, the Romans broke in and slaughtered the rebels, including Simon Bar Kokhba. With the death of their would-be messiah, all but a few of the remaining rebels gave up the fight. The Romans had won, as they always did. What was the aftermath? The reconquest of the country and the scorched earth tactics used resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, nearly as many as were taken as slaves. Cassius Dio writes, 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their most important villages were destroyed. 580,000 people were killed in the battles, while the death toll from famines and plagues, they do not have a number. Thus, nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. Unlike many large numbers cited from the ancient world, many believe the death toll claimed by Dio is pretty close to accurate. Others have estimated 2/3 of the population from 130 was dead by 136 in Judea. Whatever the exact numbers, Judea was now severely depopulated. Many of the survivors migrated from the war-torn zone of destruction to Galilee and coastal areas. Not all who wanted to stay put were able. Hadrian banned any Jew from living in or even entering Jerusalem or the surrounding area. Jerusalem was to be a fully Greco-Roman town. Colonists were brought in from across the empire to settle here and in other depopulated areas of the province. Hadrian now officially suppressed the Jewish religion. He prohibited the teaching of the Jewish law or the use of their calendar. The most sacred scrolls of the Torah were ritually burned in the new temple to Jupiter Capitolinus, where the Jewish temple had once stood. Jerusalem had already been renamed as Aelia Capitolina, but in the aftermath of the war, Hadrian changed the name of the province itself to separate it from the Jewish identity. He chose a name deriving from an enemy of the ancient Israelites, the Philistines. Their name, once translated, gave the province the name Syria Palestina. This third Jewish revolt was the most significant event in the development of modern Judaism, after the destruction of the temple, of course. Attempts at regaining political independence were now atrophied after 3 failed uprisings. The center of Jewish intellectual and spiritual life shifted. The Jewish communities in Galilee and in the Parthian Empire, just called Babylonia by the Jews, became the centers of new interpretations of the Jewish faith called Rabbinic Judaism. Part 4. Machinations of Succession. After leading from Judea in 132 or 133, Hadrian at last returned to Rome and was there by early 134. He returned a worn-out man, not because of his constant traveling, that seemed to energize him, but because of his twin losses. First, he had lost Antinous, and second was the loss of his idealism. The Jewish revolt had robbed him of that. Doubt entered his mind about the feasibility of his commonwealth. His days of traveling and micromanaging the provinces were over. Rome, or more specifically his grand villa outside of town, was his home now. When the revolt in the province formerly known as Judea had been crushed, he did not celebrate a triumph like the Flavians had after their victory in the first Jewish revolt. Instead, he received only an imperial salutation. The vibes of victory between the two revolts were very different. The Flavians hadn't been in charge when the revolt began, so they were not at fault for its outbreak. Better yet, they had brought back heaps of booty and valorized their victory on the Arch of Titus. But Hadrian's victory was one that should have never been needed. The revolt was a black mark on his quest for peace and prosperity. Little material reward came to Rome, except an abundance of slaves. So the celebrations of victory were muted. Hadrian now occupied his time writing poetry and wandering his large estate. A poem of his survives. Roving, amiable little soul, body's companion and guest, now descending for parts, colorless, unbending, and bare, your usual distractions no more shall be there. A turning point came for Hadrian around the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt reaching its end. In 136, the mental exhaustion of running his empire, along with persistent illness, caused his health to seriously decline. That year, he suffered a hemorrhage of blood and nearly died. Not long after, his wife, Sabina, died. Their marriage had been one of convenience, and there had been little love between the two. They never had children, which is important for what we'll cover next. And Hadrian suggested that if they had not been public figures, they would have gotten a divorce. The Historia Augusta spreads the gossip that there was a rumor that Hadrian had poisoned her. Although I think it's unlikely she was poisoned, a motive can be imagined for Hadrian killing her. As his health faded, he may have feared who she would pick as his successor if he died before her. Maybe he remembered how Trajan's wife, Platina, had pulled the strings behind the scenes to ensure his own succession after Trajan's death. But again, Roman historians loved their accusations of poison, so we shouldn't believe every rumor. Still, Hadrian had enough respect for her, or instinct to cover his tracks, that he asked the Senate and they agreed to deify her. After Sabina's death, and with his health failing, Hadrian began to earnestly choose an heir. He knew how important this decision was, given his own experience sealing the deal after his predecessor, Trajan, had left things a little too unclear. The succession between them ended up going smoothly, but Hadrian knew how fragile the transfer of power could be, and he wanted to leave no room for error. Now, for years, Hadrian had telegraphed that a man named Servianus would be his successor. But by 136, Servianus was an old man, 90 years old. All the assumptions and expectations were that, in place of Servianus, Hadrian would pick his ambitious grandson named Salinator. This man's father had served as consul with Hadrian in 118 and was a friend of Pliny the Younger. 3 of Pliny's letters were addressed to him, so they were a well-connected family. Salinator was given a special place in court and prepared to be his heir. But when Hadrian almost died in 136, he changed his mind. His choice has left people scratching their heads ever since. Instead of old Servianus or his grandson Salinator, Hadrian adopted Lucius Caionius Commodus, a consul of that year. This man took the name Lucius Aelius Caesar. This pick was against the wishes of everyone. Why him? Well, this man was the son-in-law of one of the 4 ex-consuls Hadrian probably had executed. Was Hadrian feeling guilty about the executions that tarnished his first years and trying to make up for them? The Historia Augusta only says that Hadrian chose him despite his sole recommendation being his beauty. Other modern historians have wondered whether Lucius Aelius Caesar was Hadrian's illegitimate natural son. This seems to be pure speculation, though. The best guess, in many people's opinion, is that Hadrian may have seen promise in this man's successors, his own son Lucius Verus, 8 years old, and especially his son-in-law-to-be Marcus Annius Verus, 17 years old. This Marcus was cut from the same cloth as Hadrian, committed to a Hellenistic lifestyle of philosophy and physical vigor. This change in plans did not sit well with old Servianus or Salinator. They threw a fit and may have even attempted a coup, which, if it happened, went nowhere. Hadrian had Salinator executed, and he ordered Servianus to commit suicide. Before his death, Servianus is said to have prayed that Hadrian would be left longing for death but unable to die. The Senate was outraged at Hadrian for both his change in plans and for executing them both, especially the elderly Servianus. The way they saw it, Hadrian was so cruel that he couldn't leave the 90-year-old Servianus to die in peace. With Servianus and Salinator out of the way, Lucius Aelius Caesar was in focus. He remained as governor of Pannonia until 137, when he served as consul again. In this role, Lucius revealed his own weak state. In a public ceremony, he could not lift the ceremonial shield or make a speech before the Senate. In his diseased state, he was given too much medicine, and on the first day of 138, Lucius Aelius Caesar died. I'm not sure if Lucius Aelius's health had rapidly deteriorated or if Hadrian had simply overlooked his physical weakness. But this was strike two against Hadrian's succession plans. With his own health worsening each day, Hadrian didn't have time to waste in picking an heir. He hunkered down, and 23 days later, Hadrian came back with a new name: Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Antoninus. This Antoninus was a well-liked senator who had been a consul in 120 and was chosen as one of the governors of Italia when Hadrian had split it into 4 new ones. Despite his prominent past positions, Antoninus did not immediately agree to being adopted and made an heir. He took a few days, but eventually agreed to take on the monumental responsibility of becoming princeps. Maybe the risk to his life if he refused Hadrian's offer convinced him. As part of the deal, Antoninus was made to adopt the young son of Lucius Aelius Caesar, Lucius Verus, and his own wife's nephew, Marcus Annius Verus. Antoninus had been married to his wife, Faustina, since at least 115. She was the niece of Hadrian's late wife, Sabina, so there was at least some familial connection through marriage between Hadrian and Antoninus. If we look closely at Hadrian's first choice, Lucius, and his backup pick, Antoninus, we find he is cleverly looking far into the future, past the person who would become princeps when he was gone. Hadrian was probably trying to find a bridge to ensure the teenage Marcus could take over as emperor when he came of age. Both choices had familial ties to Marcus and weren't likely to rock the boat too much before it was time for him to rule the empire. Part 5. Dutiful. With Antoninus adopted and his plans for succession back on track, Hadrian was left to wait for his death. For months, it seemed the prayer of Servianus was being answered, that Hadrian would long for death but be unable to die. His last days were miserable. In July of 138, Hadrian finally succumbed to his long illness. He died at his villa outside of Rome, and his remains stayed there until the grand mausoleum he had built for himself was completed in 139. With the death of Hadrian, let's pause for a moment to reflect. Edward Gibbon, the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, made him one of the 5 good emperors that characterized the Nerva Antonine dynasty. But what do you think? Was Hadrian a good ruler? How you answer will say just as much about you as the subject of the question. What qualifies as good in a ruler? Is it peace and prosperity, justice and benevolence, or is it conquest and glory? I'm not here to tell you how to answer that question, but I will tell you what I think about Hadrian, a man who was moody and proud but generous, who had a clear vision for what his empire should be that broke from precedent. I do think Hadrian was a good emperor in many ways, with a few major flaws. His vision for a Roman Commonwealth, which I keep referencing in this episode and last, seems prudent in many ways. A shared culture would unite the empire and draw in the energies of the plethora of people in the provinces. If Egyptians or Dacians or Spaniards could be just as Roman as someone born beside the Tiber, the empire's potential talent pool would be far larger. With increased competition would come increased skill in all areas. His emphasis of strict borders to the empire, giving up Trajan's conquests in Mesopotamia and some of Dacia, and Britannia beyond the wall, also seems wise in most ways. If your goal was peace and prosperity, avoiding continuous expansion and military spending seemed like the right course. We can quibble on particulars. Maybe Hadrian shouldn't have given up Scotland or Armenia, but ultimately his aim of peace and prosperity was successful. The state's resources could be spent enriching his subjects' lives rather than on war. I'm answering this question through the lens of a modern American, but working toward peace and prosperity for his subjects rather than military glory is certainly what I would prefer in a ruler. Oh, and he popularized the growth of a beard, which future emperors followed. Gotta give him some credit for that. Aside from those positives, I find Hadrian to have a few significant flaws. First was his tendency to micromanage. Traveling the provinces certainly allowed him to see his empire at the ground level and intervene in his subjects' interests. But I'm sure the same could have been done with less spending and more equitably if Hadrian had delegated the tasks to his governors, like Trajan had done. Another mark on his record is the killing of the 4 ex-consuls at the beginning of his reign. You could say that these murders prevented wider instability, but that seems like mere conjecture and begs the question of whether it's okay to murder to ensure peace. Next, Hadrian's inflexibility with the Jews seems like a major flaw. Great suffering could have been avoided if he had allowed the Jews in Judea to rebuild their own temple, or even if he had just left them alone. He didn't have to build a Hellenistic temple, at least partially dedicated to himself, on the holiest site in Judaism. I think his vision of unity led him to discount that not everyone wanted to share in the culture Hadrian was pushing. My last critiques of Hadrian look more at his long-term impact. The question that comes to mind is whether his defensive policies, or ones modeled after them, ultimately doomed the empire to fall. In the short term, these policies brought peace. In the long term, it made the empire always on the defensive, responding to threats and incursions, instead of being the initiator. This type of reaction can only result in a slow death. In prior days, Rome had a universal vision that all the world belonged to Rome, ever expanding outward to new boundaries. The Roman god Terminus, the marker of boundaries, always moved forward, never back. Despite all the temples he had dedicated to him, despite his lover Antinous being hailed as a god, and despite his late wife Sabina being deified, whether Hadrian himself would be deified was an open question. Hadrian's successor, Antoninus, became emperor in July of 138. Antoninus was a senator, and the body was happy to have one of their own as princeps. But his first action, as their head, was to ask for Hadrian's deification. The Senate was reluctant to grant this. They were bitter at the execution of Servianus and Salinator, which in turn brought back the old memories of the 4 murders which began his reign. The Senate deliberated and refused to offer Hadrian deification. Antoninus wasn't having this. He threatened to resign his post if the honor was not granted to his adopted father. This extreme action persuaded the Senate, and they relented. In turn, Antoninus was granted the title Pius, meaning dutiful, for his faithfulness to Hadrian. Ever since, he's been known to history as Antoninus Pius. Next time, we will take our first steps into the long peace of Pius. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.